So here I am in 2.83.18, which is what I refer to as my EN because the splash screen is EN. It's classic, but I still love this version of Blender. And we're using Boxcutter 719.1, so it's also an older version of Boxcutter. If we press N, we can bring up the N panel, and basically we can jump to the panel that's designated for Boxcutter, which will have the help. And one of the first things in the help to notice is that it lets us know that we need to select a mesh to cut. Otherwise, we're just going to be drawing world shapes instead of actually drawing a cutter on the shape, which requires that we have it selected. The focus of this is the help. So the help is something that we've had for a while, and we've tried to add in all the hotkeys and additional functions that we've added to be talked about at relevant points. And to show that in action, let's turn on snapping, and we now have dots. And we see that a new option was added, basically control to enable snapping. So by holding control, we're now able to use snap dots on this particular mesh. However, if we click on grid, we see that we now have the grid, and we're able to bring up the grid and use that. And basically the help is telling us to hold control to use these snappings. However, in the event that you decide you want to try to use the static grid or static dots, we'll switch to static grid in this case. We see that whenever we hold control, there are quite a few hotkeys. And these hotkeys aren't necessarily in the best order for usability whenever it comes to users. For example, we see that, pressing spacebar will pause the grid and spacebar will unpause or unfreeze the grid. But align A was showing at the very beginning when we were holding control and still just tracing around the surface, which if we were to press A at the time that we are bringing the grid up, it makes no sense for us to actually have A showing. And also left click to confirm operation and right click to cancel. These shouldn't actually be showing because an operation hasn't yet been started. So just showing that, the help tells you about everything that you're able to do with static grid, but it isn't telling you about it in the most optimal order for you to do whatever it is that you want to do. In fact, we see right here that control right click allows us to basically extend the grid. We can hold shift in order to extend it in a very specific direction. Anytime the border turns black, that means that the grid is stuck up on screen. We see that we're able to press G in order to grab. We can press shift in order to move it freely without having to snap it to individual grid units. We can press R to rotate it, but we can hold control and actually snap our rotation to grid units whenever we're rotating. So there's a lot that we're able to do with it in addition to pressing tab and getting rid of it, which is also the purpose of spacebar. So now let us jump over to the latest version of Boxcutter and talk about how help has been refined. So let's first just turn off everything. We'll go in and make sure, static dots is off as well. And if we press N, we can use the N panel and jump over to Boxcutter. And we see that, basically the same thing as what we were talking about before, except when we hold control, we see that same thing. When we bring up the grid, the same thing, except now it'll display the unit size. So whenever you roll the wheel up and down, it'll tell you what the unit size is. Over here in the help panel, in the event that you do not opt in to having Boxcutter notification showing, which we don't have a notification for grid size changing. So specifying that the grid size has changed anywhere is an improvement. Also, it's at the bottom. So now let us jump into the nitty gritty of things. So I'm just going to enable static grid, and we see that the static grid format has changed. And this is because the issues that we had before where irrelevant items that weren't needed are no longer showing. So let's just press tab in order to pause it, and we see that the help is a lot more focused, a lot more consolidated, and there's no longer issues with irrelevant information showing. A is at the bottom for align, which is something that we never talk about, but just so you know, if you hover over a face and you press A, you can actually realign the grid to that area in the event that you have it in a pause state. So if I just shift and roll the wheel, which is basically using subdivide, then we can just press A and it will basically realign the grid over that particular area. We also see that whenever we're in this mode that the items that we are able to use are the only things that are listed right now. For example, Shift K will activate knife project. So it's harder to use because I'm holding control at this time, but if I hold shift and I press K, we've basically knife projected this mesh, and you can't actually see it at this time, but if we were to press Alt V and enable wireframe, you can see that basically the grid has been knife projected geometrically into this mesh. So that part is actually working the way it's supposed to. However, I'm going to press Control Z a couple of times just to get rid of it. Typically, whenever I use knife project, I will have the grid in a pause state, get it precisely where I want to, maybe look at it in a view that's actually advantageous to the operation at hand, and then from there press Shift K in order to perform the knife project operation, which is now specified in the help at a more opportune time. We see that, pressing tab or space will freeze the grid, so we can try that out by just pressing tab, and then we see that more options are now available to us. So whenever it comes to static grid, it's not really that complicated. However, I could see how the previous way that help was formatted in the way that it was maybe not the best way to convey the information to users as far as what this grid has to offer. So just for those who are new to Boxcutter, we have two different types of grid. We have our classic grid, which basically I refer to as a spider's web. Basically, you roll the wheel, you hold control, you're able to bring it up. You can also click this lock icon, which will let you press control, and the grid will remain up on screen. And we also see that in the event that you are in a locked grid state, that it will notify you that pressing escape will disable snapping. So in the event that you do not want your grid to no longer align to where we have it aligned on this face, like for example, we're actually looking at this face perpendicular to the view, so the grid is actually a little bit weird. However, we can still basically draw a cut and attempt to make this work and then go through and perform the operation, even though we're looking at it at such a perpendicular view that it's just not working out for us. But we can just rotate the view, grab this grab dot, and move things. And because we have grid lock on, whenever we grab the draw dot, we see that the grid actually comes back without me having to hold control. And this is also reflected in the help, but we also see that whenever you draw a shape, that there's a lot more help to be conveyed whenever it comes to dealing with shape things. So grid is no longer even in the running, but there has been improvements with the help in the way that it conveys this information. So if you are new to Boxcutter, definitely try expanding the end panel, and using the help should help you get around a lot easier.